it a little bit more and give some more detail. And this is on St. Augustine's book, A Treatise on the Predestination of Saints, which is about 100 pages. And to reply to Roman Catholic apologists who will say that St. Augustine didn't believe in predestination or election as uh, the Reformers and John Calvin and um, Reformed theologians today. Their argument will be that St. Augustine believed in baptism regeneration, so that's not the same as Reformed theology, so they say. And there are some that would say that St. Augustine believed that you could fall away from grace. But there is a problem, and the problem is that in scholarship there has been debates between scholars, Protestant and Catholic, on what did St. Augustine actually teach on predestination. There's been massive scholarly debate for a long, long time concerning St. Augustine. So how do we deal with that? Well, the answer is, in his treatise on predestination of the saints, it's one of his latest works, so it comes after the Pelagian controversy. It comes after his main body of writings. And in the book, he clearly states that he is beginning to write retractions, and he makes it clear that he was a synergist, that he believed that it was God and man that worked in salvation. But he had come to realize, studying Romans 9, 10, and 11, and Ephesians 1, he come to realize that this was not actually biblical. And so he believed in a full-blown predestination, that God chooses his people. And I'm going to go through his... So, when a Roman Catholic apologist, whoever they may be, says St. Augustine believed you could lose your salvation, they're not being accurate to St. Augustine's writings, because his later writing on his doctrine of predestination, he clearly makes it statement that he clearly states that he made statements saying that about man's cooperation with grace and things like you can lose your salvation, but he makes it clear that he wants to retract some of the things he said. So you have to get St. Augustine's works in the historical context, and I'm getting this book, A Treatise on Predestination of Saints, in its historical context. It's one of the last books that he wrote, so it's important because he says that he makes retractions. Now, in this book, I want to just, on page 3, he says, "Therefore I ought flint to slow to show that faith by which we are Christians is the gift of God." So he believes that faith is a gift of God. He says in page 4 that no one sufficient for good works. In other words, that good works does not bring you salvation. He says in chapter 5, so no one is sufficient for himself either to begin or to perfect faith. So he's saying that faith is of God. In chapter 6 he says faith is increased by God. In chapter 7, that's where he makes his retractions. He says, eventually when I was retracting all my small works, page 5. So this is important because he's making retractions here. He talks about that God chooses the foolish to confound the mighty. In other words, it's God that chooses. In page 9 he says, certainly such an election is of grace, not at all of merit. So we're seeing here, the teaching that is given is very similar to John Calvin here. God's salvation is unsearchable and stands in Romans 11. We are justified by faith. And it's faith from God in chapter 12, chapter 13. All that the Father come to me. Chapter 13, all that the Father comes to me. In other words, people will be saved because God draws them. Chapter 14, he wills whom he will. Chapter 15, chapter 16, that faith then is by God's will and its completion is God's gift. Chapter 17, that grace is, or predestination is the hidden ground of God. Chapter 19, talks about Abraham and how God promised him and elected him. Chapter 22, and in chapter 22 God gives us help. He gives us grace to obey his commands. Chapter 23, he does state that he believes in infant baptism, and he believes that an infant dies, that the infant will go to be with God. But that in no way impacts his doctrine of his doctrine of predestination, which Catholics say he did not teach, or they try to modify it or soften his doctrine of predestination. He says in chapter 29 that God's dealings does not depend upon any contingent merits of men. So you see here, we're doing real scholarship here. We're going systematically through nearly every chapter of the book. Chapter 30, he covers predestination in context of Jesus Christ. He noticed in chapter 31, it talks about Christ was predestined to be the Son of God. So how can you attack predestination? And page 21, he says, as therefore that one man was predetermined to be our head, so we being predetermined to be his members. So he's saying Christ was predetermined to be our head, so we are predetermined to be his members. Chapter 33, God's calling is irrevocable. Chapter 34, the elect are a gift of God. By choosing them, he makes them heirs of the kingdom, page 23. We are elected to be holy, chapter 37. Chapter 42. So much of what St. Augustine teaches there is about predestination and that God does not lose his people. He did believe in baptismal regeneration for children, but you can see the seeds of what John Calvin comes up with is very similar to what John Calvin, like I said, this main book, he focuses on Romans 9, 10 and 11 and also Ephesians chapter 1. Yeah, we don't agree with everything St. Augustine says, but we have to be careful we don't read our Roman Catholicism or Protestant theology, Reformed theology, or our Roman Catholic theology into St. Augustine. We have to look at his book in its totality, and we've taken one of his books and we've taken it in its totality so we get his quotations in the context. That's how you have to do historical inquiry when you're doing church history. You can't just take one quotation and say St. Augustine said this or St. Augustine believed that. It's more nuanced than that. It's a little bit more complex than that. So we've taken one book and we've just looked at many of the chapters to see what he was saying. And I hope that's been a help to you. Okay, take care now. Bye now.